Three, two, one. This is fun. We're official, guys. It's real. We're on Zoom. We're on the internet. So, let me just click it real quick. Yeah, here we go. Okay, we are good to go. So, tonight we're starting our series called True Christianity, and the whole point of that is, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about what does it mean to be a Christian. And so what we want to do is start from, the big framework and then work our way down. What does it actually practically look like? And, for us, I think a lot of people have misconceptions about what does it mean to be a Christian, like we mentioned. And one of those is that the biggest one, I think, is that the definition of faith itself. I think it's really important to clear up is because people think that if you have faith where you don't have evidence. And so where, like the less evidence you have for something, the more faith you need to kind of like leap across, take this blind leap in the dark. And that's actually the polar opposite way about how Jesus defines faith. He says, if you don't believe what I say, believe the evidence and the works that I do. So we're really encouraged by Jesus himself to say, hey, look at the evidence and follow the evidence. So that's what we're going to do tonight, is take a look at the evidence. And I think that's so important because we live in a soundbite world. We live in a world that is consumed with small and temporary things that are very, very fast. We forget what happened in the news yesterday. And yet at the same time, our souls crave a deeper meaning. Our souls crave that we could have something to ground our lives on and really not be blown about to and fro when the world is shaking. And so if we don't have deep answers to deep questions, then we're going to end up living pretty shallow and quite honestly vain lives. So I think it's important for us to take that step back and say, hey, where do we start from in the beginning? So I'm hoping this is really going to help three people. One is the Christian who's not thinking deeply, is how do we think deeply about these things in the first place? So you got to beg the question. The second is somebody who's in a spot who believes in Jesus, but doesn't really have, that has a lot of doubts, that really is almost afraid to voice their questions because they're concerned about the conclusions of these things. Like if God doesn't exist, like where do I go from here? So don't even ask the question in the first place. And then lastly, someone who's just coming from a skeptical position, say, hey, I don't really believe in God at all. So convince me, like where do we go from here? So that's really what we're hoping to do tonight. And so we got 4 topics for our series on True Christianity. The first one we're talking about tonight is, does God exist? The second is why Jesus? And there's so many other gods, so many other paths in life. Why is Jesus the way, the truth, and the life? And then lastly, second to last, is the Bible reliable? Is the Bible a historically reliable document, or is it just a collection of myths, or is it some psychosomatic retelling of history? And last is, if God, why suffering? Very practical question for our time, and something that we all ask and we've all got to make sense of. So with that, Steve and I are going to kind of tag team this first one together, and we're going to be talking about does God exist? So let's start at the biggest possible level, Stephen. If I don't believe in God at all, I would say, ask you the question, does God exist? And how do you know? How do you know that God exists beyond just taking this blind leap in the dark, which is not what we believe Christianity is? So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that everyone at one point in their lives has either asked this question or has met someone who's asked this question, which is, how do we know the existence of a God? And I think the best way to tackle this question is to hit it right at the origin and to, start from there, asking questions like, where does this all come from? Or like, can we trace a chain of cause and effect back to a source? And that brings us actually to our first point of our argument for God's existence. And it's called the Kalam cosmological argument, which is essentially a modern formulation for a cosmic basis for the existence of God. So from like a huge macroscopic viewpoint of the universe. It essentially has 3 claims. So these 3 claims are like very clearly stated out. The first claim is everything that began to exist has a cause. The second claim is the universe began, and therefore the third claim has to be the universe has a cause. So let's look and dissect at these 3 claims. So the first claim, which is that everything that began to exist has a cause. I don't think it's not fair to say But you can essentially say that believing that something that can pop into existence is more of a stretch than actually, magic. Essentially, it's like, when you pull out a rabbit from a hat, you know where that rabbit is. You might not know how they hit it, but you definitely know it's in the hat somewhere. So it's very fair to say that when you believe in something, popping out of nowhere, it's a huge stretch you are asking the other person to make, in believing in that statement. If something can come into, being from nothing, then why don't we see this happen all the time? It's a fair question, right? Because if this has been a scientific fact, it should be, duplicated no matter what, because that's the principles of science. Yet, no matter how far advanced theoretical science has gone, no matter how far advanced, the practical experiments at like something like the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland has gone, we cannot duplicate those exact scenarios where something can come into being from nowhere. And that's the problem. And what we see, though, is that everyday experience and scientific evidence proves our first premise. If something begins to exist, it has a cause. Your actions lead to create something that does have a cause. And that isn't just me saying it, it's literally what we experience as human beings. And so that essentially proves the first claim. So then you have to come to the second claim, which is the universe had a beginning. Now, to answer this, we have to go back a little bit. We have to look at it from the Aristotle question, which is, has the universe, existed forever, or did it have a beginning? This is a question that has plagued physicists and philosophers throughout human history. In fact, some of the most famous physicists have in fact, taken a position that, no, the universe has existed forever. One famous physicist being Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton famously believed that the universe was this finite space, was stable, and has always just been there, and we are just discovering the laws of physics. Famous philosophers, including like Bertrand Russell, has said that the universe is just there, and that's all. But for all the science nerds out there, and this is where we're going to bring in a little bit of science, we have something known as the laws of thermodynamics in the universe. And the second law of thermodynamics, which essentially governs how heat is transferred and moved around in the universe. The second law of thermodynamics states that the universe is slowly running out of usable energy. Now, think about it. If the universe was here forever, it would make sense that we would have run out of usable energy right now. But the fact of the matter is, we are still here with the universe slowly running out of energy, but it hasn't completely gone to zero, which definitely points us back to a definite beginning. Now you look at someone like Albert Einstein and his equations of general relativity. They give us a way to meaningfully talk about the past history of the universe, because you have people and scientists, these are very famous, well-renowned scientists like Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, who used Einstein's equations. These are Einstein's equations, by the way, to show that the universe is expanding, to the extent that in 1929, Edward Hubble, one of the world's most famous astrophysicists, measured the redshift in light from distant galaxies. Now, in case, just to explain this, light exists on something what we call as an electromagnetic spectrum. And so different frequencies exist on the spectrum. What Edward Hubble did essentially was he was measuring these galaxies around our own central galaxy, which is the Milky Way galaxy. And what he noticed was the light emanating from these galaxies were of a certain frequency. Usually when something matches a redshift, it means it is expanding or moving away from a central position. This is hard, empirical evidence that confirms that the universe is expanding. And when you rewind it all the way back, it's expanding from a finite point in the distant past. Therefore, it's fair to assume that the universe has a beginning outside of itself. So the third thing is does the universe, and how do we know the universe has a cause? Well, look no further than Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, which is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? The Bible starts with the assumption that there is a single transcendent God that has always existed and is the cause for the universe existing. And I think it's fair to say that we've all felt at some point in our lives when we're at the lowest of our lows and we face the existential ache in our lives, we ask, God, where are you?
Mm-hmm.
Are you here?
Yeah.
Can we hear you? Are you not interested in my pain and suffering? Well, this finally can be answered and anchored outside of our temporary low moments. I believe that the universe is an open system, which means that if God intervened once, he can do it again. And that is one of the reasons why we actually pray. We primarily pray so that we can commune with God, but we also pray that he can give his intervening help in our lives. And I think that's amazing because if the universe was a closed system, it means that whatever is determined will happen and nothing, can change it. Essentially,
it's locked in.
It's locked in. But the beauty about this is that because God exists, he can break in to save us from the mess that we have created. And that is essentially what he claims, a Messiah. So I think this is a phenomenal argument from a cosmological perspective to see the existence of God. So yeah, I think that's one argument. What do you think about the next one, bro?
That's great, Stephen. I love that. Just you just kind of ask the question, well, what caused that? What caused that? What caused that? To get all the way back to the beginning, and then you just ask, what went bang, right? So it had to be full of an unimmeasurable amount of energy. Mm-hmm. It had to be outside time and space because time and space began at that finite point. Yeah. And what we're going to see with this second point is that this could have only come from a mind, with the complexity of the design. And so that's a classical definition of God: omnipresent, omnipowerful, omni-knowing, like omniscient. And so that's how we're going to work our way back to seeing that God exists. When we look at the universe, what we see is an unimaginably complex design. And we see that at the very fabric of the universe. So there's the laws of physics that govern how particles interact, and all the way down to the atomic level. And within those laws of physics, there's something called the constants, and there's always over 70 of these fundamental constants, something like gravity, the cosmological constant, the weak and strong force of the nuclear force, and then even something down to like the proton, neutron, electron, the mass of each one of those things. And each one of these things is so finely tuned and balances on such a razor's edge that life could not exist if one of these things was even moved by an infinitesimal amount. Let's put some numbers to this. So these are hard to really fathom. So if you think about the number of seconds that have passed since the universe began, if you take the point back, some would say that it's over 13 billion years old. If you sum up all the seconds in those over 13 billion years, you would get something around 10 times 10 to the 20th power. That's 20 zeros behind it, seconds. Well, now let's take this gravitational constant. That constant governs how two masses interact, right? Like the Earth and, say, an astronaut. The astronaut's gonna be pulled back down. And there's a gravitational constant that governs that interaction. That constant has a specificity down to 60 decimal places. So 1 times 10 to the 60th power. And if that was to be changed at the 60th decimal place, goes 1 up or 1 down, the universe as we know it could not exist. And even chemistry, life couldn't exist at all. Take another one, the cosmological constant. So if it was, that is 1 times 10 to the 120th power. So that's an unimaginable number of zeros, 120 zeros afterwards. If you change it again, 1 tick up or 1 tick down, the universe would have too much explosive power and it would just burst out and explode, and we wouldn't have enough gravity and force to bring it back and to form stars and planets and galaxies and solar systems. And if it was too strong, then what would happen is it would just immediately collapse in on itself. And so we see that there's over 70 of these constants that are hardwired into the universe. They're in the fabric of our universe, that if they weren't like this, you and I certainly couldn't exist. And then nothing but basically hydrogen could exist. And there would be no conscious observer. So when we got to ask the question, what explains this, right? We just observe this, what explains it? And there's 3 real possible explanations. One is necessity, that the world, the universe by necessity must be finely tuned for life to exist. The second is chance, that we just got really, really lucky And the third is by design. So let's go through those one by one. Necessity. It's just, if you look at all of the constants and the quantities determined by the laws of nature, there's just no reason that the fine-tuning of the universe is a necessary fact. In fact, it's much more likely it's not contingent in any way. And so we can just cross necessity. It doesn't have to be this way by any way, shape, or form. It's kind of just there on the list by formality, by logical possibility. And so the second is chance. And this is a lot of people's favorite one. And I mentioned those large numbers just to show and kind of give some perspective of, you know, seconds in the universe, and then gravity being 40 orders of magnitude more sensitive than there are seconds that in the universe's existence, just to show how completely improbable this is. So, you know, there are much more finely tuned variables than gravity or the cosmological constant. And so what some physicists have come up with is a problem, or another way to solve that. It's called the multiverse, right? So they say, well, you know, there's a universe generator, and this universe generator spits out so many universes that it's likely that a universe that permits life and conscious life, such as ours, would exist. And so we're not surprised at all, because there's these infinite amount of universes, and here we are, so let's just get on with life. And that falls flatly false for two main reasons. One is that this idea of the multiverse that originates from a universe generator is completely unscientific. It's not detectable, it's not observable, it's not measurable, and it's not provable. Do you know what we call that? Fantasy. It's called science fiction. It just is not real. It's people are so committed to this idea of chance that they have to create a new philosophy just to explain it. And the second would be, it actually doesn't solve the issue of complex design that we see in all of creation. Because what it does is it just pushes the problem back one step further. However complex our universe is, if there was a universe generator that has created hundreds of billions of unimaginable amount of universes, that would be incredibly complex. And then the question is, well, what made that thing so complex? It just moves, it shuffles the question one step back and makes it more complicated. And so we get to someone like Sir Frederick Hoyle, who's an astrophysicist at Cambridge. He says this: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. And so that's what leads us to the conclusion. We just simply look at the facts, that the design is really the only possible explanation for the universe that we observe. And so, you know, again, what is an all-powerful, all-knowing, outside of time and space being that has brought this universe into existence? That is the definition of God. So there's a God who has finely tuned this universe for life to exist and for you and me to exist. Again, now these are very, almost, I want to say, basic biblical concepts. So we get to something like Psalm 19, verses 1 and 2, it says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. I don't know if you've ever been out late at night and just looked up at the stars and just marveled. It's just, wow, this is unbelievable. This is my favorite time of year, August, September, just because the nights are still a little bit long and the temperature's cooled down a little bit, and you can just sit outside and just enjoy it. Say, wow, this is incredible. You know what, the more we learn about the universe, the more we realize this sense of awe and wonder and transcendence is because God has been intimately involved in designing this world to exist. And beyond just kind of the macro scale of the universe, God is intimately involved in the specifics in the design of each one of our lives. And the Bible talks about that in Psalm 139. It says this: for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So God shows the utmost of care for this universe and our very lives. And that gives us the deepest of connections with God, a trust for him, and a purpose to our life at a daily level. And that's just simply profound. And, you know, I hope you can start to see like the big level of 40,000 foot God exists. And now we can see his hand in designing the universe, that there's a mind behind it all and a purpose and intention. And then what does that, Stephen, how does that really play out in how we interact with one another? That's going to lead us into our third argument here.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, we've so far seen the, you know, the link of cause and effect can go back to God. and that the hardwired conditions for us even existing points to God. So then lastly, like you said, Billy, we have to target at something which is so relatable to our day-to-day life, which is, can you be good without God? Let me get this off my chest straight off the bat. Of course you can be good without believing in God. But the question is, what objective basis is there for saying something is good or bad, right or wrong, apart from God? The claim of the moral argument is simple. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values in this world do exist, as we know, and therefore God exists. Without some objective reference point, you have no way of saying whether something is left and right, up and down. It's that simple. Let me give you an example, Billy. Let's say you are in a car sitting in the back seat at a traffic light, and the car next to you starts moving, and you're wondering whether the car next to you is moving or whether you're moving. So what are you going to do? How would you know? Well, it's simple. He would probably look to the horizon to find an objective reference point to see whether the car next to him is moving. If he sees that the horizon is moving, I'm pretty sure you're going to be feeling sick, and you probably will never know. But that's the beauty of this whole equation, essentially, is God's nature provides an objective reference for moral values. It's the paramount standard against which all actions and values are measured. If there is no God, there simply is no objective reference at all. All we are left is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint, aka subjective morality. It's like you preferring strawberry ice cream and myself preferring chocolate ice cream. Yet my preference for chocolate ice cream cannot be validated upon you and cannot be binded upon you because you simply prefer something else, right? Subjective morality is simply that. It's one single person's perspective, and it's not valid or binding on anyone else. It's so profound when you think about this that it's amazing, because one of my favorite quotes from this atheist who is Richard Dawkins, he said, "In a world without God, there is no evil or no good, only blind, pitiless indifference." I mean, that's astounding to think if foremost atheist is coming about making the statement. See, God has expressed his standards in terms of commands, and those form the basis of our moral duties as human beings. So a good example would be God's essential attribute of love is expressed in the command, love your neighbor as you love yourself. This command provides the objective basis for the good of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. Conversely now, as in the opposite, we can objectively condemn greed, abuse, and discrimination. This is literally just from God's own command. So this, however, raises a problem. Is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good itself? And the answer is actually, it's neither. God wills something simply because he himself is good. I mean, that's just astounding, because a good example would is like God is the standard for moral values, the way a live musical performance is the standard of a recording. The more the recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely our moral action conforms to God's own nature, the better it is. So now we are like, oh, well, how do we guess, what God's nature is? And, what are we supposed to do? Well, the funny thing is, we already have the ultimate revelation of God's nature and character. His name is Jesus Christ. We don't have to look any further than that. And in fact, we don't have to guess what God is like or what he wants from us in the most complex of situations. See, if atheism is true, then there can be no moral standards, and thus there have to be no moral obligations or duties. For the atheist thinks that humans are just complex accidents of nature, essentially highly cognitive evolved animals. But we know that animals have no moral duties. When a lion kills a gazelle because it's simply stronger and the gazelle is much weaker and slower, we don't bring the lion in front of a tribunal, right? It's like, you kill this, poor gazelle. We don't do that. Or when a male grizzly bear kills its offspring, we don't send it to prison for such a homicidal act. It's just simply because we know the animal kingdom has no moral set of duties or responsibilities. That's the rules. Now, if God doesn't exist, we should also view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally wrong.
Yeah.
See, the problem with that, though, is in our world, there is a good and bad, right and wrong. These do exist. Just as our senses help us to experience the world around us, and that convinces us that the physical world is real, our moral experiences help us, to be convinced that morality and a moral sense around us does exist. Every time you or me or anyone says that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice, you affirm your belief in an objective moral standard. It's just how it is. We all are well aware that child abuse, discrimination, racism, and terrorism are just wrong for everybody at all times and in all places. You don't have to try hard to look back at injustices back in the past to be like, I wonder why that isn't wrong. It's pretty obvious why we can say it's out and out wrong. Is that a personal preference or an opinion? No, it's simply just because we know that that is wrong and we know when something is right. That's simply because the existence of an objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about all of this and you have to come to those conclusions to take away, Billy, this is something that has been profound in the last few months, actually. Yeah. Our world right now, and look at us right now in the United States, has been going and been crying out for justice, a plight to right the historical wrongs that have been committed in our society. Without the existence of God, not only do we lose the ability to objectively define what is right and wrong, but we lose all hope of an ultimate justice being served to the perpetrators of that injustice. It truly becomes a meaningless plight of humanity at that point. God cares more about right and wrong than we do. Because think about it, if he's giving us his standards to live by, it clearly means he's invested in us to follow those standards. It's really easy to say that, oh, God is distant, or he seems uninterested in the evil being perpetrated in the world.
Yeah.
That couldn't be further than the truth, simply because God is the definer and defender of the moral standard to which everyone must be accountable to. Everyone that has existed, everyone that's currently existing, and everyone that will one day come into existence. And finally, God brings hope to those lost in the pain of being abused by our world. Yeah. God is the champion of those who are oppressed and constantly reminds the world that to oppress the vulnerable of the world is to set yourself up as his enemy. Just like he was the champion of Israel in the past when they were surrounded by all those many nations. He is the champion of the downtrodden, and that's what we love, to show the meaning of having God in our lives and the existence of this amazing, amazing being who is actively more than just an idea. Yeah. He's a person.
Yeah, that's so great, Stephen. I'll add on to that. Before I do, I just want to let you guys know that we're going to have some time for Q&A here in a minute. So if you have questions, put it in the chat. Just comment on something, and Steve-O and I will take a stab at it when we're done. But, Stephen, I just love what you said, especially some of those conclusions that we see sociologically just happening in our country right now. I think we've got to think deeply through these things. We are facing deep issues. And so we've just got to take time to think, time to reflect, time to be, clear-headed about how we navigate these things. And once we do that, I think that we see a real tension in our culture. We see two things, that are really coming head to head right now and causing our world to splinter at an alarming rate. So on the one hand, we've been told by our culture that we are nothing more than animals. We're just really lucky, and we ended up here. And our chief end, our main purpose in life is to consume and enjoy. That morality is relative, as good as our own personal happiness, and that we shouldn't let anyone stand in our way, right? That's what the world says. Do what you want, YOLO, let nobody stop you. And if anybody stops you, then they're the enemy.
Yeah.
So I would call that some version of hyper secular individualism. There's no God in the picture. There's no purpose, just consume and enjoy. But we've seen the logic of that play out in our culture. And what has that led us to? It's led to people being taken advantage of, massive injustice in our country, broken families at every class and demographic, and a political divide deeper than it's been in this country since the Civil War times. And so if that's where it's leading us, then we also see that the world is crying out for justice, because we see the fruits of it. This is absolutely wrong. This is not relatively wrong. This is not mostly wrong. This is not my personal preference. This is evil. This is wrong. But if we don't have an objective reference point, what are we actually talking about? Right? It boils down to a game of authority and power.
Yeah.
Who has the power to enforce it? And whenever you start using power to enforce because you are morally superior, that, and history has proven this, leads to cycles of oppression. And so we have to constantly, and I think if you're a Christian here, you should be confident in appealing to God's standard as the ultimate standard that brings peace, that brings joy, and that brings hope. I want to give you two reasons why. One is that we have a misconception of freedom. Freedom is not the absence of restrictions, right? Because when we start talking about morality and moral duties, people will say like, well, that's going to weigh me down, bro. Like, I don't want anything to do with that, right? The presence of the right restrictions will keep you inside of your purpose. So just imagine a fish, right? If you take a fish out of water, it's technically more free. It's broken the boundaries, but that fish will die in a matter of minutes. And so the same thing is with us. It just takes longer to die. God has given us moral boundaries to stay within according to what he's made us for. He says, don't lie. You weren't made for that. Don't cheat. You weren't made for that. And on and on and on and on we can go. Don't steal. You weren't made for that. And so those moral boundaries are supposed to keep us in the path of life and flourishing. So that's the first point, is that these are not restrictions to weigh us down. This is the path that can lead to life. And second is we should be able to appeal to a higher standard, is because that's what the great men and women of history have done before us. Think of the leader of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. That's what he did. So one of his most famous writings is Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And in there, he had been arrested and been thrown in jail because of some of the actions he had been taken to protest injustice in this country. And from that jail cell, he wrote this famous letter. And he says, at what right do I have to, as a minister of the gospel, to disobey the laws of America? And he lays it out. He says, I judge the laws of America by a higher standard. So the human laws are here, and I appeal to a higher standard by which to differentiate the right and wrong laws. So he says, and I appeal to the standard of God, the justice of God. So it says, in disobeying the law of man, I have obeyed the law of God, and I have appealed to the ultimate justice. And so if that is what Martin Luther King Jr. is doing, then I think, and that's consistent with what we just saw, then we should feel very comfortable appealing to a higher law. And I think this tension is because our world simply doesn't have the correct categories of properly being free and what true joy and satisfaction looks like, and then what justice is actually anchored in. It's not anchored ultimately in power. It's anchored in the character and the nature of God, right? It's not just might makes right. It's that there is an intention to this world. And so I think this is important for us to think about because, it always boils back to God. Everything at the end of the day ends up being theology. And so we need to think deeply during these times when things are complex. And we need to be able to untangle these things issue by issue so we can find peace in our soul and then the right action steps for us. And I think even beyond that, though, just thinking deeply is God is not just an idea. God is a person. God's a person to be cherished, to be loved, to be related to be spoken to, and to receive words from. And we have to know how to relate to God. And I think the point of all this is that all three things that we've talked about tonight can really culminate at one moment. The existence of a creator God, that creator God having a specific plan, intentions, and purpose for reality and presiding over it. And that God has a moral standard and he has created us for a specific purpose. And I see all these three things culminating together at the hill called Calvary, at the cross of Christ. God himself became incarnate. The infinite became finite. He clothed himself with humanity, just like you and me, man. Like, here we are, right? He became one of us so that we could know him, we could see him, he could be tangible. He's not just an abstract idea. And then we see that God had a specific plan that he laid out since before the foundation of the world, is what the Bible says, specifically that Jesus would come And what did he come to do? He came to right the wrongs that we had committed. We tend to think that, evil is out there. Unfortunately, the line of good and evil runs through every human heart. So when Jesus comes, he comes to rectify what we have wronged. And that's what he does on the cross. He bears the wrath of God for our injustice, for our moral transgressions, so that he can freely offer us the gift of forgiveness, of love, and of reconciliation. And so again, these things are not separate ideas that have no connection for us. And I think this is the most beautiful thing about Christianity, is that in Jesus, and in specifically the cross and the resurrection, we see the unification of all these ideas in the person of Jesus. And that, again, not as an idea, but as something and someone we get to relate to. So, just a couple last takeaways. If we're watching this right now, God has a specific plan for our lives, and he's not done. If we're going through hard times, it can be easy to miss that, and he's not done with us yet. So I want to encourage every one of you to get to know this God better. And not just, I want to challenge you to think more deeply and intellectually about this, but also challenge you to get to know him more personally. Calm your heart, spend time in prayer, and cry out to this God. God, if you're there, I want to know you more deeply. I want to relate to you more intimately. And I also want to invite you back for the next 3 weeks as we continue to unpack these things, and join us as we really dive into what is true Christianity.
Yeah.
And so with that, we're going to take a time for question and answers. And I like to call it more like question and response, because I don't have all the answers, but we got some good questions. So, all right. We got one coming through here. It says, a lot of people throw evolution at a lot of these moral concepts. For example, humans evolved from monkeys and became advanced beings that developed morality later on. What should you say to argue against that? There are a lot of people who have argued against that. I think someone to look up that could really help you this, it's called William Lane Craig. He's a Christian philosopher and apologist. And what this boils down to, and it ultimately really fails as an evolutionary view of ethics, it's just another form of groupthink and pragmatism, basically saying that we have evolved our moral standard as a way of survival, and survival is pragmatism. So I think Richard Dawkins, that Stephen quoted earlier, hit the nail on the head. If there is no God, there is no anchor. There is no standard to appeal to. It's all just what works. It's just some form of utilitarianism. And so he says, just to requote him from what Stephen said earlier, is if there is no God, there is no good, there is no evil, just blind, pitiless indifference. Some other atheist scholars and philosophers will say, the universe doesn't care about you. You're not here on purpose. You're just a cosmic accident, and the universe is going to go on existing finally after you're gone. So just get on with the living. And I think that's consistent. And so we just have to challenge people with consistency. If you think your morality is just, just practical evolution, you don't actually mean that when you cry out for justice, right? We're not talking about practicality and pragmatism. And this really, again, breaks down because there's such a thing as in-group ethics and morality and out of group. So inside of your tribe, you will treat people a certain way. And, you can have very sophisticated group ethics, but outside of your tribe, you will kill, you will steal resources, you will pillage and take advantage of. And that's been pretty well documented in the animal world. And unfortunately, throughout human history, it's been pretty well documented that that's how we treat each other too. So it's a clever idea. It doesn't hold up. And it's really all about pragmatism. It doesn't ground it. At the end of the day, it's just what I feel. I feel this is wrong because that's what my genes tell me to feel. And my genes tell me to feel that because it's what helps us all survive together. But it's not actually real. So good luck with that. That's not how that works. It's not compelling. That's not going to change anybody's heart. And that's certainly not going to call a wicked person to change their ways. They're just going to become more sophisticated in how they perpetuate wickedness. So that's how I would respond to that. All right. Cool. Do we have any more questions here?
People are typing.
You better type. Now's your chance. We don't know. So if we've got no more questions, I think we'll we'll end the stream here for now. I think Dave posted the link here in the Zoom, reasonablefaith.org. Great place to kind of explore some more of these deeper questions. I really encourage you to go check out some videos that William Lane Craig has come up with. He's got hundreds of podcasts and articles and debates. He goes around the world and debates the biggest and brightest minds, and he goes straight at them. He's a very logical thinker, and he's a very clear-headed thinker. So he's not, maybe as bombastic or loud or charismatic as some speakers is, but when you actually listen to the arguments, I think he's the most convincing one. He just simply cannot be beaten. And stay on the lookout for Billy and Stephen University class of 23. So yeah, guys. All right, we're gonna go and stop this live stream, and I'm gonna post some